Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. Alpheus Cutler was an early church leader that helped build the Nauvoo Temple. He eventually broke with Brigham Young, and Steve Shields would tell us about the religious movement he started in Independence, Missouri. Check out our conversation.
The fundamentalists. If we were to put them in the mix, and it's hard to get numbers because they just simply don't talk numbers. We only know numbers by anecdotal information. So the FLDS has 8,000 to 10,000. The Apostolic United Brethren has 8,000 to 10,000, somewhere in that range. Those are the two largest
organized groups.
Organized structural institutions. I've heard numbers of 50 or 60,000 fundamentalist Mormons all told. Many of which there's either some smaller, like the Centennial Park. I don't want to call them a group because the Centennial Park priesthood affiliation maybe is a way to talk about those. You've got Naylor and Nielsen. You've got the guy up in British Columbia, Blackmore.
Okay.
Winston Blackmore. He's actually incorporated.
Oh, he is.
It's the Church of Jesus Christ, parentheses, original doctrine.
Original doctrine.
And that's their corporate filing in Canada. He's got 500 or so, and Nielsen and Naylor and Blackmore have been kind of doing some. They've not merged per se, but some cross affiliation, because Nielsen and Naylor's problem with the Jeffs family was very similar with Winston's. So there's otherwise, and frankly, in all of the fundamentalist Mormons, there's very little doctrinal difference, if any at all. It has to do with priesthood authority, who has the legitimate line.
Well, and I know I talked with Ann Wild, and one of the things she said was really the largest group are what she would call independent or unaffiliated.
They're unaffiliated, that's right. So most of them are unaffiliated, but they do fellowship with each other. And you've got a large following that, Fred Collier, Tom Green, and others who believe in what they call the Patriarchal order, that every father is a patriarch over his own family and has full authority to ordain his children, male children. Tom Green, has done that, and he's been probably the most publicly notable of some of these. But there's dozens of those. Many of them were ordained patriarchs by Ross LeBaron, who promoted not an institutionalized church, but the Church of the Firstborn, which is a spiritual institution. And I don't say that derisively. I mean, there is, I think, a lot of legitimacy to that argument. But he ordained several of these folks to be patriarchs. They're not followers of Ross LeBaron necessarily, but they do subscribe to that patriarchal order of the priesthood, which is I think it's a legitimate expression. And it certainly has some good scriptural arguments for it. But, they do their own thing with their own families, and those families can be extended families. Children marry others, and they're not marrying within the biological family.
Right.
I know some folks that used to be part of Fred Collier's family, and they've left and become Salt Lake City LDS.
Oh.
So, it takes all kinds.
Well, and that's pretty good, because I know you said you had the 6. Those 6 were from the original.
They were from the original,
period.
right? They came out of that a lot of people call it the succession crisis. I'm not sure it was as much a succession crisis as it was just a crisis, a continuation crisis, because it could have all fallen apart completely. So William Bickerton is the only one of those 6 leaders who never knew Joseph Smith and was never baptized in the original church. But he's the spiritual successor of Sidney Rigdon. And, you know, who came from who and where should they end up? It's just my choice. You know, I mean, there really isn't always a rational way to figure out the generational connection. On one hand, you know, maybe I could have put Bickerton as a generational next step from Rigdon's first church, but I chose not to. He always traced his authority to Sidney Rigdon. But when Sidney Rigdon's first church organization fell apart, Bickerton and a few others who had been in that just continued on in local branch work and did some missionary work. Then Bickerton affiliated with Brigham Young. All of his folks joined up with the Salt Lake Church. They were all baptized and ordained again, and Bickerton was baptized and ordained an elder on the same day. And it's interesting, there's never any mention of confirmation in those early years. You know, when did confirmation really start to become a regular thing? It's somebody else's paper. So Bickerton was a Brighamite, to use the old term, for a little less than a year, when the missionaries came through to say, it would have been
1853, I believe.
52.
52.
It was either late 51 or early 52. They went out and said, okay, we're going to do this at General Conference. We're going to have a conference in August, and we're going to declare this publicly. Bickerton immediately left, and most of those branches that were part of that group in the Pittsburgh area just, we're done with that. And so then it was like, so now what do we do? And they continued on, I was duly ordained by Sidney Rigdon. You know, my priesthood authority comes from him. Brigham Young, after all, didn't have the right authority because he's a polygamy promoter. And we'll just continue on and do the Lord's work. So for the next 7 years, almost, they have these little branches, and there's some growth there, and all in the coal mining areas of what's now West Virginia and southern Pennsylvania there. They, in 1859, said, they anointed and ordained William Bickerton as prophet, seer, and revelator. And he issued some revelations, and they all were they did that. It took them 2 or 3 more years of pulling together and then finally organizing officially. About 1863, 2 or 3, I think, was when they had an official conference where they organized a church and began ordaining apostles. And then Bickerton was then reordained as president, prophet, seer, and revelator. So coming out of what I call the fragmentation era, 1844 to 1865-ish, those 6 that I listed earlier are the ones who survive into the 21st century. And some to large degree of success, others not. Alpheus Cutler's church has always been small, and they do not proselytize. They don't believe in that. They believe that Alpheus Cutler is said to have given a revelation that in the last days there will only be 2. And from that small branch, God will, redeem Zion. So they don't worry too much about that they're getting older.
They're the ones that still have a temple ceremony. Is that right?
Yes, they do. Yeah. The upper room work is conducted in their building in Independence. I'll say on a regular basis. That doesn't mean every day or every week necessarily. I don't know any more about it than that. Nobody does except them, and I respect that. Mm-hmm. I'm very curious, of course. I once asked their church president, Stan Whiting, I said, it would seem to me that it would be important to preserve this. Is it written down? And his first counselor, Vern Whiting, said, well, we don't want to talk about that. That's not something we want to talk about. And I said, okay, fine. That's okay with me. I'm not going to push. Then Stan turns to me and he says, well, we do agree with Joseph Smith. I think that it shouldn't be written down.
Oh.
Now, I didn't press it any further. I want to know where Joseph Smith said that, but in their tradition, that's their belief. I can only presume, and as have others, that it would resemble most closely what was done in the red brick store in Nauvoo. But we're not sure. We can't be sure.
And they won't tell us.
And they won't say. And that's okay. Because they had a gap after they got to Minnesota of about 20 years when they weren't doing it at all. And I'm not sure how good memory is after 20 years of not repeating something.
Right.
But they're devout, they're sincere, they do baptisms for the dead, for deceased family members only. It's not a wholesale, let's do genealogy and baptize everybody thing. And in underneath the floor of the main sanctuary in the building is a font. And there's just a lift-off cover, but it's below ground, which they believe it should be below ground. That's where they also do regular baptisms for the living, too.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Steve Shields. In our next conversation, we'll find out if there were any connections between polygamy and Alpheus Cutler.
The Cutler folks are very anti-polygamy, and actually they believe that any claims of Alpheus Cutler being a polygamist were fabricated by Brigham Young.
There were claims?
Oh, yes.
Oh.
I actually think the evidence that Cutler was a polygamist is stronger than just a claim.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
If you'd like a transcript of this conversation, we'll have it out shortly. I'd also like to thank you for those of you who are subscribing on patreon.com. Please tell your friends. It's really helpful and will help support future documentaries and podcasts such as this. Also, make sure that you subscribe on our Facebook page at facebook.com/gospeltangents. You can get our Twitter updates at Gospel Tangents. Also, make sure that if you'd like a written copy, go to our Amazon page. You can search for that. I've got a link here, but just do a search for Gospel Tangents interview, and you should be able to find it there. You can also purchase a transcript of this at gospeltangents.com/shop. All of those proceeds will go to me and not to Amazon, so I really encourage you to do that. Make sure that you subscribe on our Apple Podcast page. I've got a link here, but you can just do a search for Gospel Tangents there. If you'd like to get a transcript, click here. To subscribe here on YouTube, go ahead and click here. And over here, you'll see some of our other videos. Thanks for listening, and we appreciate you listening to Gospel Tangents.